Hi, my name's Dave West. I'm CEO at Scrum.org. I'm actually doing this presentation from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about agility and give you a slightly different perspective of agility than maybe some of the things you've heard. I'm very fortunate to be the CEO of Scrum.org. I travel the world. Well, at the moment I don't travel, I virtually travel the world, talking to people about how they're doing Scrum, how they're doing Agile, what their transformation is like, what the experiences they're having. I have the opportunity to talk to organizations like Tesla, like SpaceX, like Toyota, and really hear how people are using agility. And hopefully I'm going to share some of those insights with you in the next 30 minutes. So, if this was 2019, if you can imagine we're in a time machine and we're now in 2019, the presentations that I'd always kicked off with me trying to explain the reason why we needed to be more agile. I'd talk about how the pharmaceutical industry were quaking in their boots when Amazon got into delivering pharmaceuticals. How GE, that amazing industrial giant, stock price was less than $10 a share. How Sears, the clothing and general retail store, is closing all of its stores because of Amazon and other competition. How even Facebook itself is in a bit of a mess, and how you can't even predict the next generation of technology giants are going to be that predictable. But I don't need to do that because of 2020, right? Everybody knows that the world that we live in today is significantly less predictable than it was in 2019. And I think many of the things that we were starting to see over the last 10, 15 years really came to a head in 2020. If I was in my office today, I would keep on the wall my 2020 plan, my roadmap, my vision, my things that I was going to deliver in 2020. Can you imagine how many of those things we actually delivered? Well, we did do some of them, which is pretty impressive, but there were many things that we didn't know we'd have to deliver, like live virtual training. We didn't think we would have to do that. We'd have to do some website work that we wouldn't have to do. We'd have to provide the ability to sort of tell what time zone you're in, things like that. These things weren't on my docket at the start of 2020, but I had to execute on them. So ultimately, the last 18 months, what we've seen is this sort of like crazy amount of unknown. Even today, and I'm speaking to you from, I guess it's July 2021, but even today, we don't know what COVID, and particularly the Delta variant, is going to have, what impact it's really having. One day we're saying, well, yes, we can travel. The next day we say we can't. We can do an in-person event. No, we have to do it remote. We don't know what's happening in the stock market. Monday was probably one of the largest drops we've seen in a long time. We live in this world of continuous uncertainty and continuous change, which ultimately means that we as an enterprise, we as organizations, we as human beings need to be more agile. I think we all get that. We understand that. But that's very different from what we used to think. Though we accepted that the world, change is inevitable and the world that we live in is in a constant change of flux, and we would say that. We'd read books on it, right? Ultimately, our systems and our processes assume something quite different. Maybe you are in situations today where you do 18-month plans, 2-year planning, or even annual planning, where you decide what the priorities are. That takes about 3 months. You then have this ridiculously large meeting with every stakeholder fighting for money and resources. Then you get these high-level plans and budgets approved, and then you move into that cycle. Many of the programs that you're on are 2-year, 3-year programs. Many of those programs have long-term aspirations, and that isn't bad. However, the reality is that we're in this constant level of change. We're continuously in this process of reassessing the situation. And that means that we have to maybe discard some of our long-term planning ideas, maybe discard some of our systems and our assumptions around risk and change and the like. How we write contracts, how we think about budgets, how we think about change requests, how we think about defects, how we think about requirements, how we think about architecture, how we think about systems, how we think about processes, how we think about skills, how we think about people. We need to think in a way that's maybe a little bit different from the industrial paradigm, which ultimately has propelled us into the position we're in today. So there's an economist that I really like called Khalida Perez. She's a Venezuelan, but she lives in London. I believe she lives in London. She works at the London School of Economics. She might live outside London. Who knows? She's an amazing thinker. She's a thought leader, really. And she talks about technology ages and how they change. Now, some of her work was taken by somebody I like called Mick Curson, and he wrote a blog about how COVID-19 has really triggered a turning point in new ways of working. Previously, the ways of working that we're talking about today, agility, was really practiced by very few. Even inside organizations where the technology group had adopted agile massively, what we saw was a divide between those people working in an agile way, working in a flexible way, working from backlogs, having things like sprints or iterations, having multiple reviews, delivering frequently, in organizations where the systems and processes weren't built around that. You'd get business people who worked in a different cycle to the delivery organization under that, and that always caused lots of tension. So what we're seeing today, though, as we transition, hopefully, out of COVID-19, is we're seeing a turning point so that the ways of working we're going to talk about in a moment ultimately are being practiced by everybody. New ways of working for all. We've gone into the deployment stage of the digital age, the next age. And many of the challenges that you face probably on your day-to-day life are friction between this new age, this digital age, and this old age, this industrial age. The industrial age was a scarcity mindset compared to an abundance mindset, which is a digital age. Not abundance in terms of everywhere there's loads of money, but abundance in terms of we can find a solution to any problem. Probably. We can try different things. We can inspect and adapt continuously. Whereas scarcity is finding the solution is going to be really hard. So we need to be really exact before we actually try to find it. We need to understand it. We need to do design up front. We need to do all these things up front so that we make sure that we're doing the right thing because there's a scarcity of solution. So we're entering this new age. Now, 19th of October 1995, big day in Austin, Texas, Scrum was introduced to the world. Isn't it incredible that it's now coming up to 26 years old? It's been around for a long time, right? And Scrum ultimately, the original paper, if you read it, it doesn't, it definitely smells of Scrum, but many of the ideas that the evolutions of Scrum are missing from it. For instance, it's quite long and quite detailed and talks a lot about phases and things like that. And it's very software oriented, very software development oriented. Now, Scrum at its heart is very simple. It's a simple, successful framework, right? It has this product backlog, this idea of sprints, this idea of a sprint having a goal, this idea of a team working on that sprint. The idea is they meet daily in a daily scrum. They work towards the ultimate goal, creating an incremental improvement to that product goal. They review that with stakeholders. They then review it, or, you know Scrum. I'm not going to bore you with that. I'm sure you've had many lessons on it, and you probably could teach it to me better than I could teach it. And Scrum at its heart, though, if we sort of pull back the onion, if you can do such a thing, if we actually dig down into the essence of Scrum, what we find is there's three very simple things that are fundamental. And you could argue there's only two, but let's go with three at the moment. The number one thing that Scrum provides for a team and for the people working on it is this idea of empirical process. This idea that we don't know what we know until we know we don't know it. That's a complicated saying, right? But ultimately, this idea that we break things down into small chunks and we deliver that and then we evaluate it because we're not totally sure that we know what we're doing. We also know that how we work is going to evolve in response to the complex problem or the complicated problem that we're trying to solve. This idea of empiricism, break things down. That's why we have sprints. That's why we break work down into small daily sort of like chunks so that we can talk about them. That's the reason why we're maniacally focused on getting stuff in front of people. Now, that holds true not just to Scrum, but for things like Lean Startup. or hacking for defense. These ideas are present in many of the next generation of ways of working that are really becoming the standard in the world. Empirical process, empiricism, the idea that we're trying to find out what actually we really mean by something, by delivering something, getting feedback on it, inspecting that feedback, then adapting learned on that. The second thing is about the teams. What we've discovered, and I think COVID taught us this, that self-managed, empowered people and teams ultimately is at the heart of any successful innovation project. In fact, in anything, it sort of works, right? Leadership needs to provide guardrails and direction and then be available for dealing with issues. Because the people that know how to solve problems are the people that ultimately are closest to those problems, right? It's not rocket science. We learned this with Dan Pink, with Autonomy, Mastery, Purpose, right? Autonomy, key element for motivation. We've learned that over and over again. Part of the power of agility is the opportunity to really empower and free people to deliver on the art of the possible, right? Now, I'm actually in Cambridge today, right? And Cambridge, there's an organization called the Broad Institute. One of the most interesting things that they did, well, they've done loads of amazing stuff. It's an amazing institution. But one thing that they did really recently, or relatively recently last year, was build a COVID lab in 5 days, test lab, which they then provided for the community. Now, what was interesting about that was it allowed my son to go back to school because we took advantage of it, or the school did that my son was at. They did it in 5 days. Now, interestingly, the hardest thing for them wasn't doing that. It was how it integrated into the city, into the Commonwealth, into the processes that Cambridge, the town, the health system supported, which is interesting, that industrial paradigm versus that digital paradigm. Self-managed, empowered teams. Continuous improvement is the last thing. Now, you could argue that continuous improvement is part of empirical process, right? And that would be very fair. But ultimately, what I'm talking about when I talk about continuous improvement, maybe it's a reminder that we improve two things in Scrum, but in Agile in general. We continuously improve the product by providing feedback. So we deliver something and we say, what do you think of that? Now, a great example is Pixar, right? We've all read Creative Inc. That's a fabulous book. Or maybe if you've got children, or if you haven't, you've seen some of the amazing movies from Pixar. I would say that those movies operate on two levels. Great stuff for kids, great stuff for adults. In fact, I probably cry more than my children, but that's another story. Up is a very emotional movie. But Pixar, what they do every night is they get the work that they've done and they review it. They all get in a big room and they talk about it. And they kind of insult it. But they do it in a very positive, psychologically safe way. They help people learn. They provide good feedback, honest feedback. They're courageous, but they're respectful. They appreciate the work that everybody's done every day and they rejoice in it, but they say, well, I don't really like how that character is positioned. Should we really think that? Now, we all know the quality of the films that come from that. So they continuously improve the product. The other thing, though, that an Agile team does is it continuously improves how they work. We call it a retrospective in Scrum, but if you're not using Scrum, I'm sure you probably still call it retrospective. It's sort of become the norm, right? So we sit there and we say, hang on a minute, how could we do that better? Can we try something? So the idea that every sprint, in the case of Scrum, but every iteration, every chunk of time, we're getting better. We're trying to improve because we know that we can always get better every day. As a big Peloton user of the Peloton, today I didn't quite get better, but I'm always aspiring to get a PB, right? A personal best. I can see those numbers and I fight to try to get a little bit better. Now, in the case of Peloton, I think I've hit my limit because of my age and my obvious fitness, but maybe teams haven't. So the reality, though, of those very simple ideas is that most organizations don't really do Scrum or Agile well. They do sort of industrial Scrum, water Scrum full. And there's all sorts of reasons for that happening, right? Existing culture, which I wrote like 15 times here, infrequent planning, legacy systems, projects, resources, culture, incentives. There's a very large financial firm in Boston area that were the second company ever to do Scrum, right? And Ken says it was the firm that allowed him not to sell his house because he was doing Scrum, nobody liked it, and this firm said, oh yeah, we'll help some. So he went and did consulting there. They had a hard time doing it. They were very successful, and then when they tried to roll it out across the enterprise, they were less successful. And when they really looked at the problems that were undermining Scrum, it was around their incentives, their bonuses. Financial services organizations have very large bonuses tied to KPIs that are decided at the start of the year, which they then monitor against, right? That's how they work. Now, those incentives stopped people from being transparent. They stopped people from sharing. They stopped people from collaborating in an effective way. They also, when it comes to the team or the individual, they emphasize the individual. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. However, it got in the way of many of the things that make Scrum work at scale, which is transparency. So incentives and bonuses actually got in the way. Also promotions. The fact that people were always never really in the team long enough to contribute because they wanted to be promoted. Projects and resource allocation, legacy systems, Conway's law always seems to undermine any good Scrum implementation. That's just the reality. And we can't change some of these things. Actually, we can. These things aren't real things. They're not like viruses or fires or global warming or any of these things. These are things we can actually change. And we can change them by every sprint, every chunk of time saying, hey, maybe, why did you spend 50% of your time working on those things that weren't in the sprint plan? Well, because my boss said I had to do it. Well, that's interesting. Why did your boss say that? Start exposing those things and fixing them. And it's not really a surprise those things are problematic when we look at some of these things. This is the industrial age, the oil and mass production age, right? All really important things that change the world around us. But at the end of the day, they're stopping us maybe. Long-term planning, project, work orientation. People talk about percentage complete, not value delivered. They talk about, are you on target? They don't say, what value have you delivered? Let's incrementally deliver that. They don't necessarily at those reviews talk about the customer and the outcomes. They talk about the work. We talked about the efficiency scarcity mindset versus the innovation abundance mindset. We haven't talked about, but I'm about to, specialization of labor. The fact that, hey, no, all I do is marketing. All I do is testing. All I do is front-end software development. All I do is, actuarial. Well, I'm in a cross-functional team where the work is lumpy. That means sometimes I'm going to be doing testing as a developer or maybe some requirements work. It might mean that as an actuary, I'm going to have to be doing some other product design as we build this new life product or insurance product. It might mean as an engineer, I'm going to have to think about not just mechanical, but also software. Now, I appreciate I'm not going to be a specialist at this thing. I'm not going to be as good as other people, but I can help. I can provide some feedback. I can storm with others who have more specialist skills to really deliver value. And of course, process control. This sort of, we tell you what to do, as opposed to we tell you what we want and give you some guardrails. And obviously this management, the change in management, right? The fact we're moving away from managers being kings to creators, to the importance of teams and people that are delivering value. So I would argue that to be agile, this is my outside-in perspective, a little bit, you have to think about 4 other things: values, discipline, outcomes, and provide community. That reinforces the simple ideas of agility: empiricism, self-management, continuous improvement. This provides the environment for agility to flourish. And it also challenges some of those things that the industrial mindset creates. So values, that's a really good starting point. Values are really important. I think we've learnt that over the last 18 months, more so perhaps than we've ever realized it before. Our behavior as members of society and our, wearing masks is a great example, but our contribution to society, our values are intrinsically linked. And that's true on a team. Now, in 2017, we added them to Scrum. I don't really mind if you pick the Scrum values, but they're a good starting point as any. You can decide what you want to do, but values are important. And the whys for these 5 is important. Why do we need courage? Because we need to challenge. Remember that Pixar example. Why do we need focus? Because we need the whole team to be moving towards one clearly defined goal. We call it a sprint goal and a product goal. We need commitment, not commitment that we're going to necessarily deliver what we committed to, what we thought we would of the sprint. No, because it's complex work, but commitment that we're going to have a good go trying. Respect. We need to create an environment that's psychologically safe. We need to listen to people. We need to respect how they're coming in as human beings. It's better if the environment is diverse, of diverse opinions. And the only way you create a good, open environment, the last one, is with diversity and respect. Obviously, these things are easier to say than they are to do. That is the truth. But every day, we should be thinking about how we turn up. How is our behavior affecting? Are we hoarding information? Are we sharing? Are we being open? Are we showing respect? Are we listening to people rather than telling? Are we coming into a situation as a scientist rather than as a preacher or a politician? Those ideas are really important. Discipline is surprisingly important in the agile approach. Now remember, we're removing many of those process controls that we originally had. So we have a little bit more freedom, but freedom requires discipline. Now, examples on the right there, WIP limits, improvement happens every sprint, work only comes from the backlog, cards describe outcomes, not just work. Only Scrum, the daily Scrum happens at the same time. Done is really done and we've defined it. We don't have partially done work. All these things are discipline things. We update our cards. We keep an idea of what's happening. We're transparent with our challenges. We attend the daily Scrum and actually contribute to it. And that's true of the retrospective, the sprint review and sprint planning if we're talking Scrum. Discipline is crucial. Outcomes is really, really interesting. Many people think that the work that they're doing obviously adds value. Why else would we be doing it? But that relationship with value is not necessarily as clear as we would like it. For instance, getting a sprint goal is really hard. Asking why we're doing each of these items is really hard. Measures, not work measures, not motion measures, not velocity, but outcome-based measures are not actually easy to find. You've got backlogs full of tasks. You don't know who your personas are. And of course, the measures, as I said, do not include the customer. Let's move to more of a value-oriented world. Let's challenge that status quo. Because if we do, amazing things happen. And perhaps one of the most interesting things is, an example, we've decided the only way to solve this problem is do this. So we break it down, we put it in the product backlog, the team picks it up, starts working on it, and they realize that isn't the only way to do it. They actually have some really good ideas of how to do it. So instead of wasting that time telling them how to do it, instead, let's describe the outcome that we seek. I remember when I was working at Marks and Spencer's in the 90s, which was fantastic, great sandwiches. The canteen was the best. Amazing. Anyway, I was working at Marks and Spencer's and we built this price and margin management piece of software. I realized when we were rolling it out, somebody said to me, they said, "Dave, this is awesome, but isn't it just," now this is the 90s, "isn't it Lotus 123? Isn't it just a spreadsheet?" I was like, oh, we built a really expensive, really restrictive spreadsheet. Brilliant. That was great. That solved all the problems. I mean, it worked, but we could have done it much easier and much cheaper using something else and got the same outcomes. That was very worrying. Luckily, nobody in the management understood that. They didn't even know what a spreadsheet was, so we moved on very quickly. And the price of tomatoes was calculated. So empowering teams to work on outcomes is crucial. Community is also another fundamental to doing this at scale. One of the most interesting things when I look at how scaling works in organizations, it isn't a framework, though there's some great frameworks, whether it's LESS, Nexus, DAD, SAFe, all these things are awesome. They have great ideas and they provide great techniques and practices. But perhaps the most important thing that any good scaled process has are people helping others to learn how to do it. Building that community of practice, giving it teeth, helping people, giving people time. Maybe 20% of everybody's time is helping others in the organization when you reach a certain level. Asking a very simple question, not what have I done today, but who have I helped? The question I ask my kids every day, and I get very bizarre answers, is who have I helped? Mostly they say you, Dada, because I haven't caused that much trouble. I was like, oh, that's great. But who have I helped today? It's an interesting question that maybe you should ask yourselves. I certainly ask myself, and I'm trying to get better every day. Now, obviously, we all know the famous Spotify model. Spotify is an amazing company, amazing products. I was listening to it. It decided what I was listening to today as I came into this presentation. And they have a mechanism via guilds and chapters that really provide that support mechanism. What's interesting about this model is they've put wood behind the arrow, right? That you have time for your guild or your chapter. They support it. And that's how they develop skills and also manage promotion. Building that community is crucial to being effective at delivering value to your organization. Ultimately, building community, if you appreciate that skills and people are at the heart of everything that you do, then building community is crucial. And building these communities of practice is fundamental. That's when I see organizations not just having a community of practice that meets once a month, but having a community of practice that does hiring, that does promotion, that is responsible for the skills and competency building, that has a clear idea of the skills that are being used and needed by the organization, and then ultimately asks that question every day. Not what have you done, but who have you helped? So, we're coming up to the end of today's presentation, or this section, or however you're watching it, in a nutshell, I think agility is about three very simple ideas: empiricism, empowered, self-managed teams, and continuous improvement. Those ideas, though, are incredibly hard to implement when you have an industrial organization around it. An organization that's still thinking of having that industrial mindset about scarcity, about resources, about managing work in a very long planning process. So the way that you start breaking that system, breaking that paradigm, is with values, a maniacal focus on customer, discipline, and learning. You create that community. Now, surrounding that, actually, to be really effective, is to think about OKRs and measurement in a different way. Think about it in terms of your current value. Are your teams or people delivering today? And is it getting better? How fast are you delivering it? How much of what you're delivering is innovation? And how much opportunity is there? If you change the conversation and you put OKRs or measures in place, we call it EBM, but it doesn't really matter what it's called, that are outward focused, that are focused on these kind of areas, you will find that agility is a natural response, because it's hard to deliver frequently to market, to do lots of innovation, to improve your current value and realize against that unrealized potential without agility. So, in summary, I think agile is the tip of a fundamental shift in the way that we work. I would argue that it is a fundamental part, now maybe I'm biased, yeah, maybe I am, is a fundamental part of a shift to a digital age. And it challenges that industrial mindset. But it's actually quite simple. It's how you would work. You know that when you get a production fault, a massive production outage, or a massive problem that hits your organization, you form a team, you do stuff quickly, you get feedback on that stuff, you improve. It's the ideas that you have and you use, they're simple. But to do it at scale requires discipline, focus on the customer and values and community. And remember that if you do this, you've got to think about how success is being measured. What are your OKRs? And you know, it starts with you. At the end of the day, it's all about you. A lot of people rail against, well, we can't be agile because. Yes, you can. You can try. And then you're right. Maybe it doesn't work, but at least you've had a good go trying. It all starts with you. Good luck on your journey.